Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about amplitude, frequency, and period. Three really important components when you are graphing trig functions. So we're going to talk about each of them separately and how they all intertwine when you're going to graph a trig function. Specifically, we're going to talk about sine and cosine graphs today. So the general form of the equation of the sine or cosine function is this, okay? Y equals a sine bx or y equals a cosine bx. A is always your amplitude and b is your frequency. Okay, so a couple things to note here. Frequency is the number of cycles. This is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, that's what the frequency is. The amplitude is how high the graph goes from the midline or the from your start, and then it goes up to the max. We'll talk about that as we go. Period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. Okay, so period we figure out by doing 2 pi divided by the frequency. And this might seem a little overwhelming at first, but as we go through some examples, I think it's going to be a lot clearer. So problem number 1 says write an equation of a sine function whose amplitude is 3 and whose frequency is 4. So all I'm going to do is substitute into my equation. I end up with y is equal to 3 sine of 4x. Okay, so that says sine there. So that's how you would write your equation. In problem number 2, it says write the equation of a cosine function whose amplitude is 2 and whose period is 3 pi. So I don't have the frequency. All I've been given is the period, so I need to find the frequency before I can write the equation. So to find the frequency, period is 2 pi over the frequency, 2 pi over b. I know my period is 3 pi, so I have 3 pi is equal to 2 pi over b. If I treat this like a proportion, I can cross multiply, so I end up with 3 pi times b is equal to 2 pi, so b ends up being 2 pi over 3 pi. Your pi's cancel out, so you end up with b is 2/3. So your equation then would be y equals 2, because your amplitude is 2, cosine of 2/3 x. B is your frequency. Okay, so that's just some basics, how you would write the equation, but we're going to talk about graphing and how these different components affect our graph. So we'll start with this one. It's saying that to graph y equals 3 sine 2x from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. And this should probably be an x here, not a theta. Whatever variable you have here, you should have the same variable here. But we're not going to be too concerned about that right now. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is think about the sine graph. We talked about the sine curve yesterday, and we said it has this general shape where it does this, right? And this happens at pi over 2. That's a pi there. Here is pi. Here is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. And the end here happens at 2 pi. That's just a straight y equals sine x graph. That's the shape of it. That's where it hits its max and its mins and its zeros. Think about the pattern of the sine graph. Right? It starts at 0, it goes to the max, it goes back to 0, it goes to the min, and then it goes back to 0. So if you want to remember that pattern, 0, max, 0, min, 0. So those are your 5 key points. We talked about that briefly yesterday. We said there's 5 key points when you're graphing it. Your 3 zeros, your max, and your min. And this is one cycle. You have all of these pieces in that one cycle of your sine graph, of your sine function. So what happens now that we're changing a couple of things? We're changing our amplitude and we're changing our frequency, right? In a basic sine graph, my amplitude is 1, so I go up to 1 and down to -1. So when my amplitude is 3, that means instead of going to 1, I'm going to be going all the way up to 3 and all the way down to -3. So that's all that amplitude means. Okay, amplitude just means you go all the way up. Your max goes up to that and your min goes down to the negative of that. Okay, so that's the idea behind amplitude. You can also think of amplitude as your max minus your min over 2. That's something that we'll get to as we go. Okay, let's talk about the period. The period here, remember period is 2 pi over your frequency, b. So 2 pi over 2, because 2 is my frequency. So my period is pi. And what that means is I'm going to complete an entire cycle of my sine curve between 0 and pi radians. Okay, so go back to the original sine curve. One cycle is completed in 2 pi radians. For this particular graph, I'm going to complete one cycle in pi radians. So basically, I'm squishing it in. I'm getting more done in pi radians. I'm fitting that whole cycle into pi radians. And so here's what I tell people all the time. You've got 5 key points. You've got the 0, the max, the 0, the min, and the 0. It's just figuring out where you have to put those. So to do that, take your period and divide it by 4. When you take your period and divide it by 4, that tells you where you need to put those max and min values on your x-axis. Okay, so here is pi over 2. If I cut pi over 2 in half, I end up at pi over 4. So there's pi over 4. This is 1 pi over 4. This is 2 pi over 4. This right here would be 3 pi over 4, and here would be 4 pi over 4. And that should make sense, right? 4 pi over 4 is the same as pi. Now, remember, I have to follow this pattern. 0, max, 0, min, 0. That's the pattern of the sine graph. So I start at 0, and then at pi over 4, I have to go up to my max. Well, in this case, my max is 3 because my amplitude is 3. So I'm going to go up to 3 at pi over 4. So I have my 0, then I have my max. Then my next one, I go back to 0. So at the next pi over 4 increment, which is here, I'm back at 0. My next one is the minimum. Okay, if I went up to 3, I have to go down to -3. So at my next pi over 4 interval, I'm down at -3. Then my next point is back at 0. So at my next pi over 4 interval, I'm back at 0. So if you see what happens here is my graph is going up. And I never draw very well on this thing. Down. And back up. That's one cycle of your sine graph, and I fit that in pi radians. If I'm graphing from -2 pi to 2 pi, I just need to continue that all the way through to 2 pi and then all the way down to -2 pi. So again, I'm going in intervals of pi over 4. So I need there, 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 and there. So I'm back at 0. So I have 0 and then my max. And then I'm back at 0, and then I go down to my min, and then I go back to 0. Going up, back, up. And my graphs on this little sketch pad, it's hard to draw them nicely, but hopefully you get the idea there. It's a little bit better. Okay, so that's what that graph would look like from 0 to 2 pi, and then again you can continue it on the other side as well. If I'm going from negative 2 pi to positive 2 pi, that's what it said. So I'm going to continue, so I'll be down here. Now notice I have to kind of go in reverse order just because I'm working backwards. Okay, instead of going forward, I'm going backwards. So I'm starting at 0 and working backwards. So I go min, 0, max, 0. So here and then back at 0 and then up to my max, back to 0, down to my min, back to 0, up to my max, and back to 0. So once you get used to the pattern, it's really very easy to do, and then it's just a matter of connecting it. And there's your graph of y equals 3 sine 2x. Okay, so pretty straightforward doing that. Let's look at the next one. So the next one is a graph y equals negative 2 cosine 4x. Super, super important. Your amplitude, because it's a measurement of how high your graph is going, amplitude itself can never be negative. So your amplitude is always positive. So even though it says negative 2 there, your amplitude is actually 2. Okay, your amplitude is actually 2. The negative says instead of normally going down first for cosine, you're going to go up first. So I'm going to explain that in a minute. Okay, your frequency here, your frequency is 4. So your period, right? Your period is 2 pi over your frequency. So your period is pi over 2. That means I'm completing one cycle of the cosine graph in pi over 2 radians. So I'm completing the whole cycle from 0 to pi over 2. Okay, let's think back about what the cosine graph looks like. The cosine graph starts at 1, so it's a little bit different than the sine graph. The sine graph started at 0. The cosine graph starts at 1. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So it starts at 1 and it goes to your, starts at your max, goes to your 0, goes down to your min, goes back to your 0, and goes up to your max. So the pattern for the cosine graph is max, 0, min, 0, max. So it's a little bit different than sine, okay? And I know this seems like a lot of stuff to remember all at once. I promise you, the more you do it, you'll just get very comfortable with it. It'll just kind of become automatic for you. But that's the pattern for cosine. Now, what happens with the negative is it flips it over the x-axis. So instead of starting at the max, we're going to be starting at the min. So in our case, our graph is going to end up doing this, going this way instead. Okay, that's what happens when you have a negative. It just flips it over. So our intervals that we need to do, I take my period, which is pi over 2, and divide that by 4. If I divide it by 4, that's the same as pi over 2 times 1/4, which is the same as pi over 8. Okay, so my intervals will be at pi over 8. Remember that pi over 8 is, right, it's a fourth of pi over 2. So I need to divide this interval into 4. So if I divide it in half, and then I divide it in half again, those are going to be my marks where I'm going to be making my graph. I'm going to stop here because I'm running out of time. I'm going to pick it up in the next video. Thanks, guys.